Most tractors don't leave a farm because they fail. They leave because the timing feels right. A new model arrives. A better offer shows up. And on paper, the decision makes sense. For a while, nothing feels wrong. Until one day, something does. Not a breakdown. Not a disaster. Just a moment during real work when you realize the tractor you sold would have handled this without hesitation. That's when regret begins. Not emotional regret, practical regret. This video isn't about rare tractors or impressive machines. It's about the ones farmers sold before they understood what those machines were actually giving them. Each tractor on this list was sold once, and later many farmers realized the same thing. Nothing truly replaced it. Ranked 10th, Case DC, the tractor farmers sold before they realized what they lost. Most tractors don't leave a farm with drama, they leave quietly. That's how the Case DC disappeared from many operations. At the time, selling it felt reasonable. The tractor was old, heavy, built for a different kind of farming. Newer machines promised comfort, convenience, and progress, and on paper, the decision made sense. The regret didn't come right away. It showed up later, during long pulls, bad ground, and days when work didn't care about comfort. That's when many farmers realized what the DC had actually been doing for them. Not looking good, not feeling smooth, just taking abuse without complaint. The Case DC didn't need to be managed. It didn't need to be protected. It was built to carry weight, tolerate mistakes, and keep going when the day ran longer than planned. After it was gone, newer tractors did the same jobs, but demanded more attention, more caution, more planning around what shouldn't be asked of them. That was never part of the DC's language, and replacing it turned out to be harder than expected. Not because Case DC tractors vanished, but because tractors like it did. Machines grew lighter, more complex, less forgiving. The kind of tractor that could be pushed hard without consequences slowly disappeared. That's when the memory changed. Some farmers realized they hadn't sold an outdated tractor. They had sold their margin for error, and years later, many of them said the same thing. That was the tractor I shouldn't have let go. Some farmers didn't miss the Case DC when it left the yard. They missed it later, when mistakes stopped being forgiven. That realization usually came without anyone saying it out loud. Ranked 9th, Massey Ferguson, 65. The tractor that seemed easy to replace until it was gone. The Massey Ferguson 65 was rarely sold in a hurry. It was sold with confidence. On many farms, the MF65 felt like a middle step. Not the biggest, not the newest, not the one anyone worried about losing. When it was time to upgrade, it looked like the obvious candidate to let go. There were stronger tractors now, faster ones that promised to do more. So the 65 was sold. At first, nothing felt wrong. The new tractor handled the big jobs. The work kept moving. Progress, at least on paper, looked real. The problem appeared quietly, in the small moments. Chores that used to feel simple now required more setup. Tasks that never needed explanations suddenly depended on who was running the machine. The MF65 had never demanded skill or strength. It fit everyone. It worked the same way for experienced hands and first-timers alike. Only after it was gone did farmers realize what made it special. The MF65 wasn't impressive. It was accessible. It started easily. It behaved predictably. It didn't intimidate. And when something went wrong, fixing it felt familiar instead of frustrating. That kind of usefulness doesn't stand out when it's there. It only becomes visible when it's missing. Replacing the 65 with something newer made sense on the balance sheet. Replacing the role it played on the farm turned out to be harder. Some farmers noticed it during long days when multiple people rotated through equipment. Others felt it during busy seasons, when reliability mattered more than power. And some only realized it years later, when teaching someone new how to work around the farm suddenly became more complicated than it used to be. That's when the regret settled in. Not because the MF65 was perfect, but because it quietly solved problems no one thought to measure. Many farmers didn't miss the Massey Ferguson 65 right away. They missed it when everything else felt just a little harder than it used to. The MF65 didn't leave behind a dramatic gap. It left behind extra steps, small ones, every day. Most people only noticed after things stopped feeling simple. Ranked 8th, John Deere 720 diesel. The tractor farmers sold. Because it was hard, not because it was weak. The John Deere 720 diesel was never an easy tractor to love. It was loud, it was heavy, and starting it the wrong way could turn a calm morning into a lesson you didn't forget. For many farmers, that difficulty became the reason it was sold. As newer tractors arrived with smoother manners and easier routines, the 720 diesel began to feel outdated. It demanded attention. It expected the operator to understand it. And when farms got busier, patience became expensive. So the decision felt practical. Sell the hard one. Keep the comfortable one. At first, it felt like the right move. The work got easier to start. The mornings felt smoother, less effort, less thinking. Progress looked obvious, but time has a way of changing perspective. Years later, when newer tractors began to show their limits, when repairs became complicated, when engines lost their tolerance for long abuse, some farmers started thinking back to the 720. Not for how it felt, but for how it lasted. The 720 diesel had never been forgiving, but it was relentless. Once running, it pulled steadily. It didn't rush. It didn't weaken under long days. It expected to work, and it expected the work to be real. That kind of endurance isn't friendly, but it is rare. Selling the 720 diesel removed difficulty from the day. It also removed a kind of durability that was hard to replace. And that's when regret crept in. Not because the tractor was comfortable, but because it had been built to survive conditions newer machines quietly avoided. Some farmers realized it during heavy seasons, when nothing else felt quite as solid. Others noticed it later, when a replacement failed in ways the 720 never had, and some only understood it after years passed, when they realized that tractors weren't getting tougher anymore. The John Deere 720 diesel wasn't sold because it lacked strength. It was sold because it asked something of the operator, and in letting it go, many farmers gave up a machine that would have kept going long after others had asked to stop. Newer tractors were easier to start. They weren't easier to rely on. That difference didn't matter at first. Ranked 7th, International Harvester 560. The tractor farmers sold because of the stories, not the work. The International Harvester 560 didn't leave farms because it couldn't work. It left because of what people said about it. From the beginning, the 560 carried a reputation. Some early problems. Some bad stories that traveled faster than fixes ever could. In farming communities, that kind of talk sticks. And once doubt enters the conversation, it doesn't take much to push a tractor toward the sale line. So many farmers sold their 560 early, not after it failed in the field, but before it had a chance to prove itself. At the time, the decision felt cautious, sensible. Why take a risk when there were other options? When neighbors were whispering warnings, letting the 560 go felt like avoiding trouble. And for a while, nothing seemed wrong. The replacement worked. The seasons passed. The choice felt justified. But years later, some farmers began to notice something uncomfortable. They saw other 560s still working. They heard from neighbors who had kept theirs and never had the problems everyone talked about. They realized that many of the worst stories came from a narrow window in time, not from the tractor as a whole. The 560 that stayed on the farm told a different story. Updated, maintained, and worked within its limits, it proved strong, capable, and dependable. It handled serious fieldwork. It kept pace with changing demands, and it didn't deserve to be remembered as the problem it was rumored to be. That's when regret took shape, not because selling the 560 caused immediate pain, but because it became clear that the decision had been made on fear, not experience. The hardest tractors to replace aren't always the best ones. They're the ones you never truly tested. Some farmers realized too late that they had sold a machine they never actually understood, a tractor defined by reputation rather than reality. And once that realization arrived, buying it back wasn't simple. Prices had changed. Availability had shifted. The moment had passed. The International Harvester 560 wasn't sold because it failed the work. It was sold because the stories got there first. And that kind of regret lingers. Some tractors are remembered for what they did. Others are remembered for what people said about them. The 560 sat right between those two stories. Ranked 6th, Oliver Super 88. The tractor farmers sold because it never drew attention. The Oliver Super 88 was never the tractor people talked about. It didn't dominate headlines. It didn't define an era, and it didn't give farmers a story that sounded impressive at the feed store. That quiet presence became the reason it was sold. When farms grew and equipment decisions started to feel more strategic, the Super 88 didn't stand out. It wasn't the biggest. It wasn't the most recognizable. And when neighbors upgraded to louder names and bigger promises, the Oliver began to feel ordinary. So it was let go. Not because it failed, not because it struggled, but because it didn't announce its value. At first, selling it felt harmless. The new tractor looked better on paper. The brand carried more weight. The numbers made more sense in conversation. Progress felt visible. But over time, something subtle changed. The Super 88 had been the tractor that never interrupted the day. It didn't demand special treatment. It didn't surprise anyone. In the best possible way. Once it was gone, farmers noticed how often they now thought about equipment, about limits, about quirks, about workarounds. The Oliver had never required that kind of attention. It had simply fit into the rhythm of the farm. That's when regret surfaced. Quietly, just like the tractor itself. Not because the Super 88 had been exceptional in any single category, but because it had been consistently right. Replacing it with something more impressive didn't replace the feeling it created. The sense that work would get done without negotiation, without second guessing, without the machine becoming part of the problem. And here's the part many farmers admitted only years later. The Super 88 wasn't sold because it lacked value. It was sold because its value didn't make noise. By the time that became clear, finding another one felt impossible. Not because they were gone, but because the kind of tractor that quietly carried a farm without asking for recognition had become rare. The Oliver Super 88 didn't leave behind a dramatic story. It left behind a gap that was hard to explain and harder to fill. The Super 88 never announced its value. It showed it by never interrupting the day. That kind of usefulness rarely gets credit in time. Ranked 5th, Minneapolis-Moline G100. The tractor farmers sold because it felt like too much. The Minneapolis-Moline G100 was never subtle. It was big, it was loud, and it carried a kind of power that didn't always feel necessary. On many farms, that became the problem. When workloads changed or fuel costs rose, the G100 started to feel excessive. More tractor than most days required, more muscle than daily chores needed. And when efficiency became the new goal, selling it felt like a smart correction. So the G100 was let go. At first, the decision felt right. Smaller tractors handled routine work just fine. Fuel bills went down. The farm felt more balanced. But heavy work has a way of returning. Not every day, but when it does, it matters. That's when farmers began to notice what the G100 had quietly provided. It didn't just pull hard, it pulled without strain, without hesitation, without making the operator wonder if the machine was near its limit. The G100 had always worked with margin to spare. After it was gone, that margin disappeared. Newer or smaller tractors could still do the job, but only if conditions were perfect. Only if the day went smoothly. Only if nothing unexpected happened. The G100 had never needed those conditions. It was built for the days that went wrong. That's where the regret took shape. Not because the tractor was efficient, but because it had been forgiving. Selling the G100 removed excess from the operation. It also removed the ability to lean on brute strength when finesse stopped working. Some farmers felt it during wet seasons. Others during deep tillage or heavy pulls that demanded more than careful planning. And some only understood it years later, when they realized that tractors weren't being built with that same reserve anymore. The Minneapolis-Moline G100 wasn't sold because it failed the farm. It was sold because the farm changed temporarily. And when the work demanded more again, the tractor that once felt like too much suddenly felt like exactly enough. The G100 felt like excess, until there was nothing left to lean on. That's when too much tractor started sounding different. Ranked fourth, Ford 5000. The tractor farmers sold because it seemed easy to replace. The Ford 5000 was never dramatic. It didn't dominate conversations. It didn't intimidate anyone. And it didn't give farmers a reason to stop and admire it. That normality became its weakness. On many farms, the Ford 5000 felt like the most replaceable tractor on the yard. It wasn't the biggest. It wasn't the newest. And when the time came to upgrade, it looked like the obvious one to sell. Surely something else could do the same jobs, maybe even better. So the 5000 was let go. At first, nothing broke. The farm kept running. The new tractor handled the big tasks. Progress felt logical. The problem wasn't what the Ford 5000 did best. It was everything it did quietly. The 5000 had been the tractor that fit between jobs, the one that could plow in the morning, haul in the afternoon, and handle chores before dark. It didn't specialize. It covered ground. And that kind of usefulness doesn't announce itself until it's missing. After it was gone, farmers began to notice the gaps. Jobs that used to flow now required switching machines. Small tasks felt oversized. Big tasks felt awkward. Nothing failed outright, but nothing felt as smooth as it used to. The Ford 5000 had never been perfect at any single job, but it had been good enough at nearly all of them. That's when regret began to settle in. Not because the replacement was worse, but because the farm had lost its most flexible piece. Replacing the Ford 5000 with something more specialized made sense on paper. Replacing the role it played, the glue between jobs, turned out to be harder than expected. Over time, farmers realized they hadn't sold a tractor. They had sold convenience. The Ford 5000 wasn't remembered for power or innovation. It was remembered for being there whenever it was needed, no matter the task. And once it was gone, that kind of everyday reliability became noticeable in its absence. After it was gone, nothing broke. But nothing flowed the same way either. Most farms only noticed that change gradually. Ranked third, White 2-105. The tractor farmers sold because the name didn't matter. The White 2-105 was never supposed to be sentimental. It wasn't a legacy brand. It wasn't a badge people bragged about. And it didn't carry decades of family loyalty. On many farms, that made it expendable. When it came time to sell something, the decision felt obvious. Keep the tractors with history. Keep the names that meant something. Let the white go. After all, a tractor is a tractor, and branding doesn't pull an implement. So the 2-105 was sold. At first, nothing seemed lost. The replacement had a stronger name, more recognition, easier resale value. On paper, it looked like an upgrade. But over time, something subtle became clear. The White 2-105 had been doing more than just working. It had been balancing the operation. It pulled hard without feeling stressed. It handled long days without drama. It didn't overwhelm smaller jobs or hesitate on heavier ones. The tractor never asked to be admired. It just fit. After it was gone, farmers began to notice how often equipment felt mismatched. Too big for chores, too small for heavy work, too complicated for quick tasks. The White had lived in the middle, a place that turned out to be harder to replace than expected. That's when regret showed up. Not because the White 2-105 was exciting, but because it had been enough in every direction. Selling it because the brand didn't matter made sense at the time. Realizing that balance mattered more than branding came later. And by then, finding another tractor that delivered the same calm, steady performance without demanding attention wasn't easy. The White 2-105 didn't leave behind nostalgia. It left behind a workload that suddenly felt harder to organize. Some farmers admitted years later that the tractor they missed most wasn't the one with the biggest name. It was the one that quietly made everything else work. Brand names change easily. Balance doesn't. Some tractors are missed quietly, without anyone saying why. Ranked second, Case 970. The tractor farmers sold. Right before everything changed, the Case 970 didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a bridge. When it arrived, farming was changing fast. Tractors were getting bigger. Cabs were getting quieter. Systems were becoming more advanced. And the 970 sat right in the middle of that shift. modern enough to handle serious work, but still grounded in mechanical simplicity. That's why it was sold. For many farmers, the Case 970 felt temporary, a step toward something newer, something more advanced, something that looked like the future. Selling it wasn't about dissatisfaction, it was about momentum. Progress was moving forward, and the 970 seemed like a chapter that had already been read. So it was let go. At first, the future looked good. The new tractors were impressive. More features, more automation, more comfort. Everything the brochures promised was there. But slowly, the cost of that progress became clearer. Repairs took longer. Downtime felt riskier. And small problems no longer stayed small. That's when some farmers began thinking back to the Case 970. Not because it was primitive, but because it was balanced. The 970 had been strong without being fragile, advanced without being dependent. It carried enough technology to improve work, without turning the tractor into something that needed specialists to keep it running. After it was gone, farmers realized they had sold more than a machine. They had sold a level of control. The Case 970 belonged to the last generation of tractors where understanding the machine still mattered more than managing the system. When something went wrong, it could usually be diagnosed in the yard, not explained later by a screen or a code. That difference didn't feel important at first. It became important when time windows shrank and patience did too. Selling the Case 970 felt like moving forward. Living after it revealed how much complexity had followed. Some farmers later admitted they didn't miss the tractor immediately. They missed it when they realized that newer didn't always mean easier, and that progress sometimes came with strings attached. The Case 970 wasn't remembered as the best tractor ever built. It was remembered as the last one before farming crossed a line. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. Selling the 970 felt like progress. Understanding what came with that decision took longer. That delay is where most regrets live. In first place, John Deere 4630, the tractor farmers sold and later realized nothing replaced it. The John Deere 4630 wasn't sold in a hurry. It was sold with confidence. At the time, the decision felt obvious. Newer tractors were arriving with more technology, more comfort, more promise. Screens replaced gauges. Systems replaced instincts. Progress looked clean and inevitable. So the 4630 was let go. And at first, there was no regret. The new tractor was quieter, smarter, easier on the operator. Everything felt improved. Farming, it seemed, had finally moved past the old way of doing things. But time has a way of revealing what progress hides. Years later, when breakdowns became more complicated, when simple fixes turned into scheduled repairs, when downtime stopped being an inconvenience and started becoming a risk, that's when farmers began thinking back to the 4630, not because it was primitive, but because it was complete. The 4630 sat at a rare point in tractor history. It was powerful enough to handle modern workloads, yet simple enough to be understood fully by the person running it. When something went wrong, the answer was usually mechanical, not digital. The tractor didn't need explanations. It needed hands. After it was gone, farmers realized what they had lost wasn't horsepower or comfort. They had lost independence, the ability to diagnose, the ability to decide, the ability to fix a problem before it became a delay. Newer tractors could do more, but they asked for more in return. More systems, more dependency, more patience. The 4630 had never asked for that. It trusted the operator as much as the operator trusted it. Selling it felt like embracing the future. Living without it revealed the cost of that future. Many farmers didn't regret selling the 4630 right away. They regretted it when they realized there was no way back, because tractors didn't evolve past the 4630. They moved away from it. That's why the John Deere 4630 stands at number one. Not because it was perfect, but because it represented the last moment when strength, simplicity, and control existed in the same machine. And once it was gone, farming crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The 4630 wasn't missed when it left. It was remembered when independence disappeared. That moment usually didn't happen in the field, but later. Selling a tractor rarely feels like a mistake. It feels like a decision. Most machines on this list didn't leave because they failed. They left because something newer stood in front of them. And for a while that choice worked, until a small moment revealed what had been lost. That's why these tractors are remembered differently. Not for what they were, but for what farms became after they were gone. Thanks for watching Tractor World.